Well, as Stephen said, we're at the start of our new sermon series entitled Getting Relationship Right in the Church, based on Jesus' teaching in Matthew chapter 18. The description of this theme on the website and in the weekly email reads, "The church isn't just a building or an institution, it's the people of God. Cultivating strong relationships within this community is crucial if we are to better reflect his truth and grace to each other and the world around us." In Matthew 18, Jesus discusses some of the characteristics of healthy relationships which can guide us as we seek to serve God and each other more fully. Matthew 18 takes place towards the end of Jesus' life and ministry. Within 3 chapters, he is arriving in Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. In the preceding chapter, a select group of Jesus' disciples have witnessed his transfiguration, and he has also predicted his death to them for a second time. So the thoughts and minds of his followers must have been all over the place. This results in the question which we will be looking at today. And from that springboard, Jesus launches into a series of teachings, all linked to this theme of how to have right relationships. Some commentators label this chapter as a community discourse, with an emphasis on the communal relationships, interactions, and identity, which Jesus' followers, and subsequently the church, will need in order to live out the way of the cross. Our particular theme this morning, in the first talk in the series, is status and influence. In the 21st century age of social media, those words have taken on a whole new meaning. You have the chance to add your status to WhatsApp, Facebook, or Instagram, broadcasting what you want people to know about you and what you're up to in a snapshot. And then we have the influencers, people who make a living out of being paid commission by shops or companies to share their love for certain products so that their thousands or even millions of followers will cause said items to sell out overnight. But Jesus naturally has a completely different take on these words and has something pretty countercultural to teach us about them. Countercultural in his day and even more so in ours. We will look at the question, answer, warning, and challenge. So firstly, from verse 1, the question. In verse 1 of Matthew 18, we read the question which kicks off this whole chapter of discourse between Jesus and his disciples. We read, "At that time the disciples came to Jesus and asked, 'Who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?'" The opening phrase, "at that time," could even be translated, "at that hour." So it seems that Matthew wants us to know this question arose from the events which immediately preceded it. Alongside the transfiguration and Jesus' second prediction of his death, the final section of Matthew chapter 17 contains a discussion about paying taxes, with Jesus talking about the demands and requirements of the kings of the earth. With some of the disciples having had a glimpse of the heavenly realm, and with a growing unease about Jesus' talk of leaving them, it is perhaps natural and understandable that the disciples seek to understand how the hierarchies and kingships of this world will contrast with the kingdom of heaven. Matthew presents this discourse in a very reasonable and appropriate way, with the disciples respectfully approaching Jesus with their question about this topic. However, in the parallel passage in Mark chapter 9, the question arises in a different way. In verses 33 to 34 we read, "They came to Capernaum. When he was in the house, he asked them, 'What were you arguing about on the road?' But they kept quiet, because on the way they had argued about who was the greatest." We also hear of a similar occurrence in Luke 9, verse 46. An argument started among the disciples as to which of them would be the greatest. We will never know whether Matthew is being kind to the disciples in our passage and presenting yet another argument in a more positive light, or whether they actually managed to discuss this issue more calmly on this occasion. We will shortly look at Jesus' response to this question, which is very clear, and the warning he gives, which is pretty stark. So you would have thought this might be the end to the jostling for position and heated discussions about hierarchy anyway. But no. In both Matthew 20 and Mark 10, we can read about James and John petitioning Jesus for the prized places at his right and left side. In fact, in Matthew's version, they even get their mum to do the begging. And then in Luke 22, we learn that even at the Last Supper, the argument was still raging on. Perhaps for those of us who have watched the excellent TV series The Chosen and been reminded of the natural worldliness, humanity, and rough around the edges nature of Jesus' band of followers, with the different ways of doing things and clashes which ensue, these sorts of discussions and arguments should not be unexpected. And in fact, for all of us, the idea of a yearning after greatness and success is completely relatable anyway, isn't it? Celebration of those who are the greatest at something is all around us in all spheres of experience. In childhood, sports days award medals to the fastest. Stars of the week receive certificates or badges for demonstrating the best behaviour, and prize-giving ceremonies celebrate the most academic. We see actors and directors receiving Oscars and BAFTAs, and top sports people being labelled as the GOAT, standing for greatest of all time. At work, there may be an employee of the week or month, or we might just witness success being rewarded with promotion or a bonus. The world equates greatness with success, wealth, prestige, and power. And the same was certainly true in Jesus' day as well, where status and influence were very much tied in with rank and position. So Jesus' response to the disciples' question is unexpected, to say the least, and exemplifies the countercultural nature of his message, as we will see as we turn to the answer in verses 2 to 5. Jesus' response to their question is as follows. He called a little child to him and placed the child among them. And he said, "Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever takes the lowly position of this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me." Jesus calls upon a real-life visual aid to emphasize his completely countercultural vision of greatness, summoning a little child to stand amongst them. Jesus holds children in high esteem, welcoming them wholeheartedly and demanding his followers do so also. There are many admirable characteristics in a child which Jesus longs for his followers to emulate, such as their innocence and purity, their simple faith and willingness to trust, their openness to learn, their wide-eyed wonder. But here it is their lowly status which Jesus is focusing on. So this visual aid is perfect for Jesus' topsy-turvy vision of greatness. Children in Jesus' day had no status or esteem of their own. Rather, they were vulnerable and considered insignificant, so they readily realized their dependence on their parents or guardians for all aspects of their lives, for nurture, protection, education, provision, and guidance. Those who are great in the kingdom of heaven will realize their complete dependence on God in the same way. They will rely on God for his guidance, protection, provision, love, forgiveness, sustaining, encouragement, equipping, grace, patience, compassion, healing, and so much more. And did you notice that Jesus said we will need to change in order to become like the little child? In some versions, the word used is turn or repent. Jesus knows that change is needed for us to become like the little child. We are not naturally this way. Our natural tendency is to follow our own way, to do what we want to do, to think we have everything figured out, to feel like we are and should be in charge. So we must turn, we must change, we must become humble like a small child and cry out to God, I need you, show me the way. If, like the disciples, we are interested in how to be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, the key is to humbly submit to God. And Jesus also exhorts his followers to be welcoming towards children, as well as emulating them. That's something we take very seriously here at Christchurch, wanting our youngest members to feel that they play a full part in the family of God and are loved and valued. And because of the high value we place on our children and young people, we should also support and encourage those who work in our children's groups week by week, appreciating the key and vital role they play in teaching these precious children and modelling Christ to them. Having answered their question in a way they almost certainly weren't expecting, Jesus then goes on to give them a warning in verses 6 to 9. We read, "If anyone causes one of these little ones, those who believe in me, to stumble, it would be better for them to have a large millstone hung round their neck and to be drowned in the depths of the sea. Woe to the world because of the things that cause people to stumble. Such things must come, but woe to the person through whom they come. If your hand or your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to enter life maimed or crippled than to have 2 hands or 2 feet and be thrown into eternal fire. And if your eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to enter life with 1 eye than to have 2 eyes and be thrown into the fire of hell." Jesus' warning is twofold. He first warns against causing our fellow followers to stumble and fall away from God. These followers are described as little ones, but most commentators agree that Jesus is not referring to children specifically anymore. Perhaps these followers are compared to children because they are younger in their faith, or because they were heeding Jesus' exhortation to model their faith on a humble child until they are led away. Jesus uses hyperbole, which is extremely exaggerated language, to emphasize the seriousness of his warning. If the greatest in the kingdom of heaven are those who submit to God in humility and reliance, then no wonder there is a dire warning for those who put a stumbling block in the way of someone's submission to and dependency on God. For anyone who causes that necessary turn and change to be halted or reversed. In the second part of his warning, Jesus continues to use hyperbole, that extremely exaggerated language, to describe the serious nature of our sin, in other words, our rebellion against God, and the drastic measures we must take to overcome it. Living as God wants us to and pursuing holiness will involve difficult choices and painful sacrifices. But Jesus promises that the cost is worth it. So we've seen the question the disciples asked, the answer Jesus gave, and the warning he issued. But how do we apply that to ourselves and our church family here in New Malden, specifically thinking of our focus on getting relationship right in the church and our topic today of status and influence? That's where our final point comes in, the challenge. In this opening section of Matthew chapter 18, Jesus teaches us that greatness in the kingdom of heaven is nothing like greatness in the eyes of the world. Because rather than being found in wealth, prestige, power, and position, it is instead found through humility, compassion, and holiness. At the school where I work, we have 4 key values, or pillars as we call them, which are embedded into school life and which the children are encouraged to be guided by and demonstrate. These are kindness, respect, honesty, and humility. Every Friday in assembly, the younger children are asked to recall the 4 pillars one by one and give an example of when they have demonstrated it or been on the receiving end of it being shown to them. There are multiple readily given examples of kindness. I sometimes think the assembly will never end. Respect is also pretty easy to recount, and under honesty, some major confessions come to light. But humility seems much more difficult to explain, with the main examples being something along the lines of, I didn't boast when I won the cross-country race by a huge distance. Or, I didn't make my friend feel bad when I got full marks in a test and he did really badly. And my experience is that the difficulty of trying to explain it in assembly is borne out by the challenge of demonstrating it in class too. Alongside the jostling to get to the coveted position at the front of the line and the calling out of an answer which a classmate is just about to give, there is my particular bugbear. When I am helping a child with their work and one of their classmates has either finished the task or is also stuck on something, I will then sometimes feel a tap, tap, tap on my shoulder, or hear an on-repeat chanting of Miss Henson, Miss Henson, Miss Henson, or see a worksheet appear in front of my face directly between myself and the child I am currently helping. Or sometimes they even go for the triple whammy of the tap, the chant, and the worksheet in front of the face. I then obviously turn this into a teaching moment and ask whether they believe the other child is unimportant, or at any rate less important than them. They quickly respond, no, of course not, we're all equally important. And I remind them that their actions say otherwise. So they apologise and take this on board for a very short space of time until the next occasion when their impatience gets the better of them. In Jesus' day, a little child was a great example of humility. But in 2025, even from the youngest age, we are already indoctrinated with a me first attitude. We need to recognise how overwhelmingly countercultural humility is and strive to demonstrate it, both towards God, in our reliance on him and our submission to his will for our lives, and then in turn in our relationships with others, not valuing status and influence in the way the world does, equating it with power and prestige and getting our own way, but rather in terms of loving service and setting a good example. Jesus also challenges us to show his compassion in this passage, in the way we welcome children and ensure that we do not cause people to fall away from God because of our actions. He wants us to love and care for others, not lead them to harm. But compassion is pretty countercultural too, albeit not to the same extent as humility. Some people see compassion as a sign of weakness, feeling that having a ruthless streak is needed to succeed in this day and age. Others speak of compassion fatigue and think that looking after yourself needs to be the number one priority, with humility once again on the back burner. Just this past week in my home group, we were considering qualities God calls us to grow in, and one of these was compassion. I was commenting, obviously being me, on the Latin root of the word, literally meaning suffering with. And we discussed how that should drive us to really take the time to get alongside people and be there for them as they go through challenges and trials. In our busy lives, it can be so much easier to just text a praying for you message. But this is not the extent of the humble, compassionate response Jesus challenges us to. Jesus used extreme language to drive home the need to take drastic action in our pursuit of holiness. This striving for holiness links to humility as we submit to God's will for our lives, and also to compassion as we ensure our influence over others is as a good example rather than leading them astray. So let's make time this week to ask God to help us to identify an area of our lives where we need to make changes, and then allow him to be at work by his Spirit, bringing about the change that is necessary. Near the start of this talk, I reflected on the 21st century connotations of the words status and influence. For those of us who use social media and WhatsApp, perhaps these spheres of communication are further areas where we need to strive after humility, compassion, and holiness, always taking the time to check whether what we are posting or messaging is in line with our submission to God's will and our pursuit of his holy standards, and will help others to feel loved, welcomed, and valued, and led closer to God rather than further away.